Welcome to Only for Your Ears and today's episode. But before we begin, I'd like to give thanks to all the people that have liked, shared, and subscribed. This is very much appreciated. Now for today's episode. The King of the Golden Mountain is a fairy tale from the Brother Grimes, which I've renamed as The Merchant's Bargain for 30 pieces of silver. The structure will remain the same, where I'll start off with a brief summary, where I'll digress on a few highlighted sentences, give a reflection, and a pearl of wisdom. Then we'll move on to how this fairy tale plays in today's society by demonstrating a few parallels and using a film called October Sky, which will be a very interesting a parallel to this fairy tale and very dynamic. Then we'll move on to the trigger points. So let's begin with today's episode. The King of the Golden Mountain, or The Merchant's Bargain for 30 pieces of silver, is a fairy tale from the Brother Grimes that tells the story of a merchant's son who embarks on a quest to regain his freedom and establish his own kingdom after his father makes a reckless promise to a supernatural being. I digress. I get the impression the father, being the consummate businessman, traded his son for great wealth. The reflection. The father's hasty decision to trade his son shows his desperate need to hang on to material wealth and how prosperity reveals his moral compass. A pearl of wisdom. The king tries to break his promise of trading in his son without realizing the responsibilities his words carry. He made a deal with the devil and now wanted to renege on it, demonstrating total mistrust. The tale begins with a merchant who saves a drowning man who turns out to be a supernatural being. In gratitude, the being promises the merchant great wealth, but in exchange, the merchant must give up his firstborn child when the child turns 7 years old. I digress. Greed has no bounds. Of course, the king sold his son for 30 pieces of silver without realizing a child is priceless. The merchant agrees. As the child grows older, he becomes increasingly unhappy with the bargain his father made. I digress. His father speaks volumes of "I don't give a damn about your life. You are nothing in comparison to my wealth or my riches." I digress. The boy must have been devastated by his father's disregard for his life. A pearl of wisdom. Unfortunately, he not only sold his son, but himself, failing to realize he had failed the test the dwarf set him. You see, the dwarf knew the king was desperate and would sell his soul just for material power. When the supernatural being comes to claim the now grown-up son, the son refuses to go with him unless he is granted a wish. I digress. Good for the son. He's learned how to do business and negotiate just like the being did. The being agrees, and the son wishes for a ship that can sail on land and sea. With his magical ship, the son embarks on a quest to regain his freedom and find a kingdom of his own. I digress. Yes, indeed, he carves out his own life and freedom, since he was a prisoner to his father's indiscretion and rotten deal. Reflection. The son also makes a better trade than his father and buys his freedom. However, the son realizes the price of freedom comes with great responsibility. A pearl of wisdom. The applied knowledge here is that the son observed his father's footsteps and became a more accomplished businessman than he was. During his journey, the protagonist encounters a magical dwarf who offers him valuable advice and enchanted items in exchange for a portion of his future kingdom. I digress. I wonder if the being arranged for this magical dwarf to keep the man company and be a sage advisor. Using these gifts, the protagonist overcomes various challenges, including battling a dragon and freeing a beautiful princess from a wicked enchantress. I digress. We all need to be rescued in one way or another, and by ourselves, it's even better, especially from our own negative thinking. The protagonist and the princess marry, and together they establish a prosperous kingdom on the Golden Mountain. I digress. This sounds like an appropriate ending to a rags to riches fairy tale. Reflection. The dwarf is a mighty foe where he magically gives the young man's powers to learn how to fight off the challenges he didn't expect. A pearl of wisdom. This magical dwarf acts as a spiritual protector who helps navigate the protagonist's steps out of unforced errors he has made during his life. However, the protagonist's problems are not over. As he becomes separated from his wife due to his own rash actions, I digress. We can be young and restless at times without being aware of developing patience and wisdom. With the help of the magical dwarf, the protagonist manages to reunite with his wife and defeat the wicked enchantress who has tried to take over the kingdom. I digress. The young man's acquired wealth attracts energy vampires hungry for power. The protagonist learns the importance of keeping a promise and facing the consequences of his actions. I digress. The protagonist perhaps understands his father keeping his promise, even though it was morally wrong from his son's point of view. The story ends with the couple ruling their kingdom together in happiness and prosperity. I digress. Happiness and prosperity must be built on a solid foundation, which I guess it is in this case. Reflection. The son demonstrates great resilience and resourcefulness throughout the story. He faces numerous challenges, including his encounter with the Black Dwarf, the enchanted castle, and the betrayal by his queen. Despite these obstacles, he remains strong-willed, eventually overcoming each situation through cunning acts and perseverance. A pearl of wisdom. The protagonist's journey has awarded him everything he wanted, including a deep understanding of what his father did. The King of the Golden Mountain is a tale of ambition, determination, and consequences of making promises without considering their potential impact, emphasizing the importance of overcoming challenges and learning from one's mistake. The jewels of making a mistake are the jewels of being able to learn those lessons and take them with you as applied knowledge. Now take a look at the parallels using a film. Now here's my critical review on how this fairy tale plays in today's society. This is a heartfelt fairy tale about a poor merchant king who succumbs to the temptations of the person he rescues to surrender his flesh and blood and firstborn for the wealth he's always wanted. This rings true in so many ways. Parents have sold their children in exchange for money on several occasions. It's considered a legitimate business, though. Just recently, a desperate young woman in Afghanistan was forced to sell her unborn child because of poverty. It has been noticed this action is not considered exploitative, But I beg to disagree, though. It's called child trafficking, which is seen as a shameful exploitation of selling minors on the black market for next to nothing, regardless of their desperation. However, I must state this. This is easier said than done. There are some women that are meant to be the carrier of the unborn child and deliver this miracle into the world with security. And there are some women that are supposed to be the mother who raises the child to full maturity. In some circumstances, the child has to learn how to be both parents to themselves, very much like I did. However, in this fairy tale, the protagonist gets to experience his childhood until he's considered a man to shape his life experience with the lessons of failures and victories, where he must take responsibility for whatever decision he has made in spite of their consequences. Broken promises, greed, and consequences of such actions are not met with an easy pass or a slap on the hand simply because one is poor. The heaviness of their karma is carried with them like a lifelong stain on their lives until this has been rectified, either through transmutation or redemption, which aptly takes place as the son forgives his father for selling him in such a desperate, hasty manner. Now we're going to take a look at the film October Sky, which is interesting, and it's a good parallel. The true story of Homer Hickman, a coal miner's son, who was inspired by the first Sputnik launch to take up rocketry against his father's wishes. In a 1950s mining town called Coalwood, Homer Hickman is a kid with only one future in sight: to work in the local coal mine like his father, like son. However, in October 1957, everything changes when the first artificial satellite, Sputnik, goes into orbit. With that event, Homer becomes inspired to learn how to build rockets with his friends and the local nerd. Homer sets out to do just that by trial and a lot of error. Unfortunately, most of the town, and especially Homer's father, thinks they are wasting their time. Only one teacher in the high school understands their efforts and lets them know that they could become contenders in the National Science Fair, with college scholarships being the prize. Now the gang must learn to perfect their craft and overcome the many problems facing them as they shoot for the stars. Along this inspiring journey, group experiences a number of challenges, followed by what's considered failure to fulfill their dreams, just like in a fairy tale. There are no real soft landings like in a dream world until we finally experience that wonderful high from finally grasping the brass ring of success and empowerment. He does have to make sacrifices, such as his relationship with his father, to achieve his dreams, very much like what happened in the fairy tale. But ultimately, these sacrifices are worth it. October Sky message is about dreams and the obstacles that are inevitable, but dreams are worth the sacrifices one must make to achieve them. Homer Hadley is a true story. Hickman Jr. is an American author, Vietnam War veteran, and former NASA engineer who trained the first Japanese astronauts. His 1998 memoir, Rocket Boys, was a New York Times bestseller and was the basis for the 1990 film October Sky. Now, here's a footnote. I want to look at the two brothers, the Wrights brothers, Wilbur and Orville Wright. They were they had a repair shop, a bicycle repair shop in Ohio. And their dream, their vision was to create a plane that would defy gravity and just go up in the air and stay there instead of crash into the ground as they did. It did many, many times. They spent 4 years trying to perfect their craft. They had two men, the brothers, and they had four people, extra people in their workshop, and they had failure on top of failure on top of failure. By the way, there was a man that had plenty of resources, lots of money. They had the New York Times, all the major papers behind him, and he was going to build this plane. Or what happened? In 1903, in December of 1903, after many, many failures and many crashes, thank goodness none of them died, they took flight, and that plane stayed up in the air. And when this rich, famous man found out about this particular plane taking flight, he gave up. He just gave up his mission. And people said, well, why? And he gave up because he didn't win the competition. For him, it was about winning a competition. For the Wrights brothers, they had no money. They made mistake on top of mistake. Was a vision. They were interested in being part of the change of the aviation and the innovation of the aviation system. And the last part I just want to mention, in 1903, Wright Flyer, the Wrights brothers, the Wrights brother, Wilbur and Orville Wright spent 4 years of research and development to create the first successful powered airplane. The 1930 Wright Flyer, its first flew as Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, on December 17, 1903, with Orville at the controls. Now we're going to go on to my trigger points and then close with my quote. Now, in these trigger points, I want to mention a little bit about money and value when it comes to a child, when it comes to a human being. We're all priceless. Now, many of you have heard me talk a little bit about my parents. I want to talk about how my parents saved face by basically exploiting their children and, coming out with a better bargain. My mother was a complete total narcissist. My dad did not want to stay married to her, and she decided to get pregnant for the second time 7 years later and see if she could hold on to him. Well, it didn't work. I was born, and unfortunately, not only was I born, I happened to almost look like the splitting image of my grandmother, which is my mother's mother. And unfortunately, my mother had a not such good relationship with her. My grandmother neglected her because her stepfather didn't like my mother. He liked the two children, but he didn't like my mother. And so he would tell my grandmother not to buy her any clothes, not to look after her. And so she was devastated by that. And she was a malignant narcissist and very abusive. She expected me to be her mother because she felt as though she was unmothered. And at the same time, my dad got out of staying with my mother because he convinced the church that because my mother was emotionally and mentally not quite stable, as most narcissists are not, he convinced them that she was he couldn't stay married to her, and they had an annulment. They didn't even, it wasn't even a divorce, Lissy, but it was completely annulled, meaning that the two children, my sister and I, we didn't exist. The marriage didn't exist, and he was free to marry his second wife, who had a daughter, and then he had a son. And so he had a perfect situation. So they both saved face, and they used their two children as weapons. Now, when my parents got divorced, my dad was asked to give me £5 every, I think it was every week. He had to pay £5 as some kind of custody money. And my mother would love to demean me. She would demean me. She said, you know, all you're worth is £5. That's all you're worth. So I can relate to the fairy tale when the father just sells his son. He just says, you know, like, I want 30 pieces of silver. I'll give him up. And then he realizes he doesn't want to do that, but it's too late because he can't renege on the deal. And so that was a trigger point for me. And, you know, being told that I was worth only £5, as it's chased me around most of my life, because when I'm feeling at my lowest self-esteem and I wasn't getting paid properly or whatever, I felt I would go back to that and think of the £5 that my mother said that I was only worth £5. Of course, she said it just to sort of demean me, and it worked. Another part is I was my mother's enemy number one, as I basically said, because I looked like her mother as she took everything out on me. Unfortunately, you know, my mother delivered me. She was supposed to deliver me, but she could not be a mother. And I don't think she could be a mother because she actually was a narcissist. It's not so much because of what happened to her that she was neglected. That's part of it. But she was a narcissist, and narcissists make lousy parents. I've forgiven my mother, though. I have. But I don't particularly want to connect with her. She's passed on anyway, but I have forgiven her. I've let her go. And I have had situations where in my life I have no children of my own. I'm not a mother, but since I have been learning how to mother my inner child and mother myself, the strangest thing is that I've attracted so many people that see me as a mother figure and want me to nurture them. And I find that interesting. It does not matter whether you have children or not. If you have that natural maternal instinct and feeling, it speaks volumes, and people can see it. People can feel that energy and automatically gravitate towards you. So that's my trigger points. These are my trigger points of this story. And you know, the child trafficking is most unfortunate. Children are priceless. We as human beings are priceless. We shouldn't be bought, but as Robert Redford said in the film Indecent Proposal, everybody has a price. And unfortunately, that's true. Now we'll end with my quote. Healing is a lifelong lesson, blessing, and gift we give ourselves, mind, body, and soul. Healing is a lifelong lesson, blessing, and gift we give ourselves, mind, body, and soul. Goodbye.